Welcome back to another video, and in today's tutorial I'm going to show you how to make just this basic Tunisian crochet sock pattern, but we're going to be using your own measurements. That way you can make these socks using whatever yarn or hook combo you want and in whatever size you want. Now, because this is a similar pattern to the ones that I've posted in the past, I think it's like 2 sock patterns, I will not be making a sock pattern available for this, but I will post up the notes on the website so that way you know what measurements to take and where to use them. So you can find the link for that in the description box below. Before we get started, I'm going to do a quick note here about the hook that you're going to need because I get a lot of questions about these hooks. So I'm going to be using a double-ended Tunisian crochet hook. And yes, it needs to be a double-ended hook. It needs to have one hook on either side. And because I get this question a lot, I'm just going to show you the photo here. For the hooks that have just a hook on one end and then it's got the long cord at the end, this is a different type of hook. So no, you cannot use this particular type of hook for this project. It would be like trying to use knitting needles for a crochet project. So no, you can't use these hooks. If, however, you have a hook like this that is connected by a cable and it has 2 hooks, so one on either end, yes, you can use these. These are totally okay to use. There are a lot of interchangeable sets like these that you can use. There's also like these that are the KnitPal ones, but either way, you need one that has 2 hooks, so double-sided. If you want short hooks like these are the KnitPal hooks. They're available down in the description box below. They have, the company has this in the long hooks, so for longer projects, but these are just the 6-inch ones. So these are the nice short ones. They come in a set of 5. I think it starts at 3 millimeters and goes all the way to 6 millimeters. So these are ideal for small projects like socks and hats. So anything you have to work in the round that's nice and small, these are a good fit. All right, but let's move on. So another thing you're going to need for this project is a measuring tape. So any measuring tape you have on hand will work just fine. If you don't have a measuring tape, you can use like a strip of ribbon or something that you can mark up, but it has to be something that is flexible, so you can't use a ruler since you are going to have to take the measurement of the circumference of your feet. Another thing you need are stitch markers. Now these aren't exactly necessary, but they are incredibly helpful. So if you don't want to have to count stitches all the time, those are going to help you a lot. And now as far as yarn, I'll be using 2 colors just to make the stitching a lot easier to see, but you can use the same color throughout the whole sock if that's what you want. You are going to need, however, 2 cakes, 2 skeins, 2 whatever, because you're using a double-ended hook and you need yarn for either end. So you need 2 of these. Mine is going to be inverted, so it's not going to be the same color as this sock. I have to invert the colors because you can't see them on camera if I use the colors in this particular order. So sorry in advance, it is going to be inverted, but I'm going to use the 2 colors. You'll be able to see the stitching a lot cleaner and a lot easier, hopefully. So yeah. So let's talk about the construction of this project. We are going to be making a toe-up sock. So this will be a lot easier to try on if you need to, but you're going to begin just where your toe ends. So not at the very tip. We're going to add that at the end, but you're going to begin where your toe ends, build the body of the sock, and then up to the leg. You do the elastic at the top, or I guess the cuff, and then you're going to do the heel and toe. But I've bored you with a whole bunch of notes, so let's get started. The first thing you're going to need is to take a measurement. So just grab your measuring tape, your ribbon, whatever it is you're using to measure. You're going to take 3 measurements. The first is the circumference of your foot, and this is going to be right below your toe because that is the widest part of your foot. So measure around the widest part of your foot and jot that down. Then you're going to need to measure from where your toe ends to where your leg begins. So the best way to do this is just to flex your foot, but yes, where your toe ends up to where the leg begins. It's going to be for an adult around 3 to 4 inches. And then the last thing you need is from the heel to how high on the leg you want your sock to go. So that's just going to be the sock length. The cuff is just additional, or at least for me it's usually additional, so I just use the length that I want for my sock and then add the cuff however wide I want. But that's just a personal choice. Alright, so here's a quick test. You're going to need to make a chain. If you don't know how to make a chain, then this project is too advanced for you. Alright, so the chain needs to be made in even multiples, so in just an even number, and it needs to equal the measurement you took for the circumference of your foot. So for adults, that's generally between 7 to about 8 inches, which is like 17 to 20 centimeters about. But whatever units of measurement you're using, as long as this chain measures that the circumference of your foot, whatever measurement that was, you're good to go. Just remember to make it in even numbers. So here, for example, my chain needed to be 7 inches. For that, I needed to make it 28 stitches, and then I'm going to jot that down because you are going to be making a second sock. So make sure that you jot down all of the different chains, all of the stitch numbers and your row counts. So keep that in mind. Once you have your chain, you're ready to begin. So before you begin your foundation row, we are going to close the round. Now I know that in other patterns I've closed the round, after the foundation row, but for this one, we're going to close it now. It makes it a lot easier, so you can adjust that for other patterns if you want to. So insert your hook into that first stitch of the chain, and then you're going to yarn over and pull that through both of the loops you currently have on your hook. So pull this top one through these bottom two, and you've closed the round. Now, we begin the foundation row just like every other foundation row. You're just going to insert your hook into this stitch and pull up a loop. Now this one is going to be just a tiny bit different because we are only going to do half of the stitches. So I already have one loop on my hook. That one does count for your stitch count. Now my chain, my initial chain was 28 stitches, so I'm only going to cast on half of them, which is going to be 14 stitches. So whatever your original stitch count was, cast on only half of your stitches. So don't insert your hook into that first stitch, you already have it on your hook. Go into the next available stitch, insert your hook into the stitch, yarn over, and pull up a loop. And now we've cast on 2. Repeat this in the remaining stitches. So remember to just cast on half of the stitches of your initial chain. So I'm going to cast on 14 stitches, and then you're going to be using a stitch marker here in just a moment. So if you don't have any handy, grab a piece of yarn, grab a bobby pin, anything you have, and place it on that last stitch. So for me, this is stitch number 14, which is exactly half of my initial chain. I'm placing a stitch marker here, and then we're going to work on the return pass. So now the stitch marker serves to just outline where the center of your sock is. So right here at that point, that's where your stitch markers are going to be. So it's going to tell you where the top of the sock is and where the sole of the sock is. So you know where the inseam and the sole go. All right, so once you've cast everything on, to work your return pass, you're going to turn your hook around, grab your second yarn, and then you're going to make a loop. So again, this is the cast on side. So we're going to turn it around, work on the back side of the hook, leave a long tail of yarn. You can weave this in later, and then you're going to work on an extended return pass. Now, if you haven't heard of the extended return pass before, this is what's going to help make your fabric stretchy because this is crochet, not knit. So we're going to try to make the fabric as stretchy as we can by adding a little bit of extra, I guess, thread to our work. All right, so we're going to begin with a chain of 2. So chain 2, and then you're going to yarn over and pull through the first 2 loops on your hook. So there's, if I don't drop my yarn. So yarn over and pull through 1, and then pull through 2. Now for the rest of the return pass, and this is the same for the body of the sock, all you need to do is chain 1 and then yarn over, pull through 2. So here we go, you chain 1, and then you're going to yarn over and pull through 2. And then again, chain 1, and then yarn over, pull through 2. And you're going to repeat this until you are left with maybe about 5 or 6 loops on your hook. So don't complete the entire row. Just leave a few loops on your hook just so that you don't lose your stitching and it doesn't mess up your tension. But once you've done this, so I'm just going to finish this last one and then I'll turn my work around so I can show you how to cast on the remaining stitches. All you need to do is just turn your hook around so you're working on the cast on side or the front end of your hook, and you're going to continue to cast on the remaining stitches. Make sure you count them just to be absolutely sure that you have the same number of stitches as you just cast on, so it's exactly half of the stitch count for your initial chain. So I will need to cast on another 14 stitches to complete the round of 28 stitches. Once you get to the end, place a stitch marker on that last stitch and complete your return pass. To show you one more time, to pick up the return pass, you're going to turn your hook around so you're working on the back end, and all you do is just chain 1 and then yarn over, pull through 2, and you repeat. Alright, so I'm going to continue with the rest of this round and I'll see you again in a moment. Alright, so I've reached the end of the round and this is what my work looks like so far. Yes, it is going to widen up just a little bit, but you need that extra stretch in this fabric, so it's totally normal. Alright, I've reached my stitch marker. So here we go. This is going to be the beginning of the round. So we just finished the foundation row. To begin round 1, which is the round you're going to repeat over and over, this next part, you are only going to have to do it once. But after this, all you do is knit stitch. So here's the very first stitch of the foundation row, and it's a little bit tucked in. So I'm going to try to show you as best as I can. If you are not familiar with what a knit stitch is, you're going to need to, you're going to insert your hook between the front and back legs of the stitch. So if you, as you see here, the vertical stitch is made up of 2 threads. Insert your hook right between both of those, yarn over, and pull up a loop. And that is how you cast on a knit stitch. So let's go into the next stitch and do it again. So there is the back leg, and here's the front leg, and you're going to insert your hook in between both of those, go all the way to the back, and you're going to yarn over and pull up a loop. And that's it. Repeat this until you can no longer comfortably cast on stitches onto your hook. You no longer need to count them, as that is the purpose behind using the stitch marker. So you don't need to count them anymore. Just count the number of rows that you crochet. So this is row 1. Once I reach that blue stitch marker, I'm going to begin round. I guess they're rounds now. So I will begin round 2. You're going to make a fabric that measures the foot length. So the measurement that you took between your toe up to where your leg begins. So about 3 to 4 inches-ish if you're using inches. But whatever measurement that was for you, that's how big of a length you need. Count your rows. It'll make it a lot easier for your second sock. If you prefer to just use a measurement, go ahead. But for me, it's easier to just count rows and then repeat that the second time around. So again, the row begins where that second stitch marker was placed. All right, I'm going to continue working on the rest of this fabric. I'll see you here in a moment. So yay, we're back, and now here's my fabric. This is what it looks like. I'm going to go through and measure it just to show you about how long it was. I needed mine to be 3 inches, and here it is. So about 3 inches. And now we're going to have to work on the gusset. So that was the body of the sock, what we just completed. The gusset is this end right here, so I'll turn this right there. That is the widest part of the sock, and we're going to work a series of increases. Now your increase counts are going to be different depending on whether you're making socks for an infant, a child, or an adult. Now for an adult, you're going to crochet 5 rounds of increases. For a child, maybe about ages like 3 to about 10ish, you're going to crochet 4. And if you're doing or if you're crocheting socks for an infant, it's only going to be about 3 increase rows. There we go. I got a little tongue tied there. So just keep that in mind whenever you're working on the sock. So just to repeat, it's 3 for infants, 4 for kids, and 5 for adults. If you're a lazy crocheter like me and really don't like to count stitches, then stitch markers are your friends. So I placed a second set of stitch markers at the top on the working side of my project. So here's the original stitch marker, here's the other one. If you notice, it is right in between knit stitches, so I placed that second stitch marker also right between the knit stitches. So just follow your stitching all the way to the top and place your stitch marker there. I went with the same colors so that I know where the center stitch marker was and then where the beginning of the round would be. But that's up to you. Go ahead and use whatever you want. So let's begin with the increases. So what you're going to do is you're going to insert your hook into the, the chain space right between the vertical stitches. So I'm going to remove my stitch marker, and then we're going to place it right here on the hook. You're going to insert your hook into this chain space. So right in between the 2 vertical stitches, you're going to see this space right here. You're going to insert your hook right into there, pull up a loop, and that's your increase. That's it. So you have now added 1 more stitch to your round. So I originally started with 28. Now I will have 29. Now you're going to cast on your stitches all the way until you get to your second stitch marker. And now here are the last 2 vertical stitches before my second stitch marker. So we're going to cast these on. And when I reach that next stitch marker, we're going to remove the stitch marker and we're going to increase right into this space as well. So I guess I'm increasing first and then removing the stitch marker. As you can tell, this is a voiceover. Normally I film tutorials in Spanish and then do a voiceover in English after. So that's why my hand gestures don't always match what I'm saying. So there you go. A bunch of possibly interesting, maybe not, facts, I guess. Alright, so continuing on. You're just going to cast on as many stitches as you comfortably can and work your return pass. Now because we have stitch markers on our hook, to move the stitch marker, all you do is just pull it onto the chains that you just made. So crochet the chain for your return pass and then slip it across. That's it. But yeah, I'll leave you to complete the rest of your return pass and then we'll work on the next increase so you can see it again. To kind of explain what it is we're doing with the increases. So the increases are only going to be on one side of your work. So as you are moving along, you're going to be adding stitches to the top part of the sock. So if we take a look at the bottom part of the sock right here, so this is the sole. If you look at this here, I have 14 stitches. Your stitch count might be a little different, but it begins right here where our stitch marker is, and then the stitch marker, or the second stitch marker ends. So between the 2 stitch markers, it's 14 stitches. Now where we're adding the increases on the top part of the sock, you're going to be adding 2 stitches in every row. So for row 1, we added 2, which left me with 16 stitches. For row 2, we add another 2, it's going to be 18 stitches, and so forth until I complete my 5 rounds. This is just so that we can add that extra space to the sock. So we are going to remove them later, but for now, we're doing the increases. All right, so once you reach your stitch marker, I'm going to place this again on my hook. and you're going to increase by inserting your hook in between the 2 vertical stitches. So right in the chain space. So here are the 2 vertical stitches, there's the chain space, insert your hook, yarn over, and pull up a loop. And that was it. Cast on until you reach the 2nd stitch marker, and I'll show you how to do that increase one more time and leave you to complete the remaining increase rows. So I'm at that 2nd stitch marker and I need to do a 2nd increase. So I'm going to pull off my stitch marker and we're going to increase right into this chain space. And then we're going to place the stitch marker back on. So there we go. And then you place your stitch marker. Make sure you count your stitches at this point and check that you have in fact added 2 additional stitches. So again, since this is my 2nd round, I won't have 16 stitches. I should have 18 stitches. Once you've double checked that, go ahead and work your return pass and then work the bottom stitches, which should be the 14 if you had the same stitch count as I did, but you'll have the original stitch count that you had for half of your initial chain. So continue working on that. Work the remaining rows that you need for whatever sock size you are crocheting, whether it was the infant, the child, or the adult, and then I will see you again. So just a refresh, for infants that was 3 increase rows, for children it was 4, and for adults it was 5. So I've completed my 5 rows and we are back at this stitch marker. So now the next part is we're going to have to cast on however many, I guess the same number of stitches as you did rows for your increase. So that sounded a little more complicated than it is. I'm going to cast on 5 stitches because I did 5 rows of increases. So if you did 3 rows of increases, you would cast on 3 stitches. If you did 4, you would cast on 4. So cast on however many stitches that is equivalent to the number of rows that you crocheted. Once you've cast those on, and yes, right now I have more stitches on my hook because I still had a few loops as I cast on the additional 5. But once you cast on however many stitches you needed to, whether it was 3, 4, or 5, you're going to complete a return pass. And you have to complete the entire return pass this time because we're going to be making a chain. So you're no longer going to be casting on knit stitches, at least not for a few stitches. So once you get to the end, you're going to yarn over, or yeah, what is it, chain, and then yarn over, pull through 2, so that you are left with just the 1 loop on your hook, and then you are going to chain. So I need to make a chain of 14 stitches. The number of chains that you need to make is half of what your initial chain was. So whatever the number of stitches was for the sole of your sock, that was hard, that is the number of stitches you need to chain. So I had 14, which was half of the 28 that I originally crocheted. You can crochet whatever number of stitches that was for you. Once you've made your chain, you're going to skip whatever number of stitches you chained. So since I chained 14, I need to skip 14 stitches. Now make sure that you are counting the next vertical stitch over, not the one that you just crocheted your chain in. So count however many stitches it was. So I'm going to count 14. I'm going to skip those 14 stitches and I'm going to insert my hook into stitch number 15. So I'm going to find, there it is, that one's stitch number 15. You're going to insert your hook into that stitch. It's just going to be a knit stitch. You're going to yarn over, pull up a loop, and once you have 2 loops on your hook, you're going to slip stitch. So pull the top loop through the bottom loop and leave that on your hook. Now this will leave 1 loop in a different color. So if you are the type of person that bothers, alternatively, you can also cast on in a different way. So once you have your 2 loops, so here's the chain, I've already skipped everything. Oh, you also have to cut your yarn, so don't let me forget to tell you that. Cut your yarn on the other side because we're going to be casting on again. Once you have your 2 loops, you're going to grab your original color, so whatever color you were using for your knit stitches, leave a nice long tail end, you can weave that in later, and you're going to pull that through, so this through the 2 loops already on your hook. And this is going to leave all of your loops the same color that they were before. So I know it bothers some people, not everybody, but if it bothers you, there's another way to do it. All right, once you've got that, you're going to cast on the same number of stitches you did at the end of, like right before your chain. So if that was 5 stitches, 4 or 3, cast those on. I'm going to cast on 5 knit stitches, and that's going to put me at the stitch marker. And see, now you have 2 beautiful matching sides. So, yay! All right, now you're just going to cast on the remaining stitches until you get to that stitch marker, which I removed, but once you get to the beginning of the chain. So cast on all of those stitches, leave 2 vertical stitches unstitched, I guess. Leave 2 stitches open. I'll show you what you're going to do with them here in just a moment. So I've reached the end of the round, and here are my last 2 vertical stitches that I have left open. We are now going to begin our rounds of decreases. So if I show you here on the sock, the gusset is made up of the rounds of increases to make it wider, and then we have to decrease it to make it narrow again. So you have to crochet the same number of decrease rows as you did increase rows. So whether that was 3, 4, or 5, use that same number of row counts or number of rounds for your decreases. Now to decrease, you're going to insert your hook behind the top leg of the first stitch and then insert your hook as a knit stitch on the second one. For those of you that have some experience in Tunisian crochet, you're going to do a Tunisian simple stitch followed immediately by a Tunisian knit stitch, and then you're going to yarn over and pull through both of those loops to decrease. So you turn 2 of those stitches into 1 loop, so now you have 1 less loop in your round. So whatever number you ended up with, I'm going to pick a random one. Let's say it was, I don't know, 32. Now I only have 31 loops in my round. We're going to have to decrease on the other side as well. And if you're new to this and you're looking at your chain going, when am I going to do this? We're going to cast on. If you're not new to this, then cast on. So once you get to your chain, you're going to start casting on, beginning on that very first stitch. You have to cast on the same, I know I keep saying cast on, I'm going to get tired of that word. You need the same number of loops on your hook as you had stitches in your chain. So I had 14, that means I will need 14 loops on my hook by the time I am done with this chain. And that is only for the chain part, because if you remember, I left a few stitches on my hook right before I started. So just make sure you're counting your stitches as you're casting them on so that you have that same number of stitches as you did on your chain. When you reach the other side, this first stitch is kind of hidden, so you may have to move your stitching around a little bit, but you're going to Tunisian simple stitch in that first one and knit stitch in the second one because you have to decrease. So Tunisian simple stitch in the first one, knit stitch in the second one so that you have both loops like this on your hook. Or I guess both stitches, not loops, those are stitches. And then you're going to yarn over and pull that through both of the stitches. So I need to grab my working yarn. There we go. All right, and you're going to pull that through. And there we go, we have decreased. So now our round is 2 stitches less. So like in the example I gave that we had 32, now we only have 30 stitches in the round. So we're good to go. So this was round 1 of decreases. Continue working however many rounds you need to complete the same number of increased rounds that you completed. Wow, that was a lot more confusing than it needed to be. But since I did 5 rows of increases, I need 5 rows of decreases. And, you know, if you did 3, do 3. If you did 4, do 4. Okay, just to show you here a second time how to do the increase once you get to the end of the row, make sure that you leave the last 2 vertical stitches open. So here are my last 2 vertical stitches right before I get to the chain. This is again where your stitch markers are lifesavers so that you don't actually have to count. So you can see the chain is on the other side. To do the decrease, you need to Tunisian simple stitch in the first stitch, knit stitch in the second. And then, you know, you just continue to knit stitch on the chain. So here we go. So insert your hook behind the top leg of the first vertical stitch, like so, and then insert your hook into the second stitch. And this is going to be a knit stitch on the second one. So pull that through the back of your fabric, yarn over, and pull through both of those vertical stitches just to cast on 1 loop. And now we are down 1 more stitch. Repeat this on the other side. So once you complete the chain, make sure that you do your decreases. So here's the other side of the chain. This is what it looks like. As you can see, there is some spacing between both sides of this stitch. That is the very first stitch of your decrease. So we're going to Tunisian simple stitch here on the first, and then knit stitch directly into the second, yarn over and pull up a loop, and we have decreased. All right, so that was round number 2. I'm going to leave you to complete the rest of it, and I'll see you here in a moment. Once you have completed your decreases, you should have the same number in the round as what you started with. So I started with 28 stitches. I should have 28 stitches in the round. Now that you have that same number, you're going to complete just the fabric the same way that you did the top part of the sock, so the body of the sock. Just complete it in the round until you get the length that you want for your sock. And here's a friendly reminder to keep track of your row counts so that when you crochet a second sock, you will have 2 matching socks. So here's what the fabric will look like once you have completed the body of the sock and the leg of the sock. I know it looks a little wonky, but it'll come together here nicely in a while. So now that you've completed the length that you want for your sock, we are going to work on the cuff. Now the cuff can be as wide as you want it to be. So the first thing you need to do is crochet your return pass until you are left with just 1 loop on your hook. So for me, it's going to be this off-white thread. So I'm just going to complete the last few stitches. And there we go. And now I'm going to chain 5, but that's just so that I get the width that I have for that the first sock. So right around here, that is a little less than 1 inch. So it's maybe about 2 centimeters for those of you that use the metric system. But you can make this as wide as you want, really. So Chain however many stitches you want to be the width of the cuff. Jot those down. And then once you've got this, we're going to cast on a foundation row. So it's going to be the same as the foundation row we cast on at the beginning of the project. So you're going to skip the first stitch, go into the second stitch. You're going to yarn over and pull up a loop. And you're going to repeat this in the remaining stitches of the chain. So since I chained 5, I should end up with 5 loops on my hook. So here we go, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yep, and now I have to cast on into the actual sock itself. So I'm going to cast on into the chain space right in between my 2 vertical stitches. And that's going to give me loop number 6. So you're going to have just one more loop than what you cast on in number of chains at the end of the row. So insert my hook into the stitch, yarn over and pull up a loop. So here we go, here are my 6 loops. Now to close the return pass, this is a regular return pass, so you're just going to yarn over and we're going to pull through 2. So there's 1 and 2. And then yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2, until you are left with just the 1 loop on your hook. Now the cuff is made up of it's a 2-row repeat. So we have done this one before, so you should be able to see it in other tutorials as well. But we're going to go over it here just so you can see it again. We're going to be working in the space between the vertical stitches, so not in the vertical stitches themselves, but in the chain space in between them. The first row, we're going to begin in the first chain space. So right in between the first vertical stitch and the second one, insert your hook from behind the fabric. So just like this, towards the front. Then you're going to yarn over and pull up a loop. So now I've got 2 loops on my hook. Yes, you're going to need to count the number of loops too, just to make sure you don't accidentally increase it. And you're going to repeat this in the remaining stitches or the remaining chain spaces of the row. But here you need to make sure you count them because you're going to skip that very last chain space. And then you have to you have to knit stitch into the sock. So here's that vertical stitch. So it's the one right next to the chain space we crocheted into the previous row. So knit stitch into the vertical stitch and pull up a loop. And then make sure you count them. You should have 6 loops on your hook at this point, if you chained 5, right? But once you have this, you work your return pass. And again, it's the regular return pass, so you're going to yarn over and pull through 2, and then yarn over, pull through 2, and so forth until you are left with just 1 loop on your hook. All right, so that was row 1. This whole working with rounds and rows just gets really confusing. All right, so for row number 2, you're going to work into the second chain space. So skip the chain space between vertical stitches number 1 and 2 and work into chain space between vertical stitches number 2 and 3. So skip here, go into this next one. Insert your hook from the front of the fabric towards the back, like so. Yarn over and pull up a loop. So now we've got 2 loops, and then we've got 3, 4, 5, and then you're going to cast on into the chain space. So just insert your hook from the front of the fabric like so, towards the back, yarn over and pull up a loop. And then just count your stitches, make sure you have 6 before completing your return pass. And that's it. So that's your 2-row repeat. Continue this until you've worked all the way around the top of the sock. For those of you that need a refresher, so for your row number 1 repeat, you're going to insert your hook behind the fabric towards the front between vertical stitches number 1 and 2 in the chain space. For row number 2, you're going to insert your hook into that second chain space in the front of the fabric towards the back. All right, so complete the rest of your row, and then I will see you again in just a moment. So here's the cuff. I have finished it and left a long tail end of yarn, which I'm going to use to sew the cuff together. I've also cut off the yarn that's on the inside, so here it is. If your stitching was a little bit loose when you finished the end of the row, just remember that you can pull on that thread right before you weave it in, and you won't have any spacing in your stitching. So there you go. All right, so now let's talk about the heel and the toe of the sock. Now these are going to be made the same way. So I'm going to show you how to do this once and then just kind of go over how to do it for the other parts. Basically what you're going to do is 4 different flaps. So 2 for the toe, 2 for the heel, and then you sew them together. So to make this a little easier to see, I'll show you how to cast on everything here for the toes, and then I will show you how to do that also for the heels. Remember that we are doing 2 flaps, 1 on the top, 1 on the bottom, and the same applies for the heel, but I'll show you that in a moment. So let's cast on the first part of the toe. So pick a stitch marker. It doesn't matter which one, just pick one. And you're going to insert your hook into the stitch right below that stitch marker. So that's going to be stitch number 1. you need to cast on the same number of stitches as half of what your initial chain was. So I need to cast on 14 loops. So that's going to be the stitch right before that second stitch marker, and that's if you haven't moved any of your stitch markers, right? So cast on 14 or however many stitches you need loops onto your hook, and this is just knit stitch. So insert your hook between both of the legs of the stitch, yarn over, and pull up a loop. So just like you would a foundation row. Once you have that set, you are going to work an extended return pass for that way the bottom part of the stitching matches the top, so the toe and the fabric of the sock will match. You begin with a chain 2, and then yarn over, pull through 2. Then from then on out, you just chain 1, yarn over, pull through 2. So chain 1, yarn over, pull through 2, and repeat until you are left with just the 1 loop on your hook. Once you get to the end of the row, that is going to be the foundation row. So your row counts for the toe and the heel are going to be different depending on the number of stitches that you had to cast on. So you're going to use half of whatever number of stitches you cast on. So I cast on 14 loops. That means I'm going to work 7 rows. So I hope that makes sense. So whatever number of stitches you cast on divided by 2 is the number of rows you're going to cast on for the toe and the heel flap. So the foundation row does not count as part of your stitch count. That is just not your stitch count, your row count. That is just the foundation row. Row number 1 begins right after you've cast on a foundation row. So it's kind of like what we did here at the beginning for the body of the sock, only we're doing that for the toe. So remember, at the body of the sock, the foundation row doesn't count into your row counts. All right, so the first 2 rows, so row 1 and row 2, you're going to knit stitch into every stitch of the row. So at the end of this, like once I'm done casting on all of my knit stitches, I should have 14 loops on my hook. So whatever number it was that you cast on for your foundation row. And that is for rows 1 and 2. Once you've completed both of those rows, you're going to begin your decreases. Now decreases begin at row number 3, and for the decrease, it's pretty much the same thing that we did for the decreases in the body of the sock, or in the gusset really. You're going to skip your first vertical stitch, and then you're going to go into the second and third. So for the second vertical stitch, you're going to cast that on as a Tunisian simple stitch. So you're going to insert your hook behind that top leg of the stitch, and then you're going to knit stitch in the second one. You're going to yarn over and pull through both of those stitches and cast on 1 loop. So I've got 2 loops on my hook right now. And then you're going to knit stitch until you get to the final 2 vertical stitches of the row. So the final 2 vertical stitches of the row, it does not include the final stitch. So these are the last 2 vertical stitches of the row right there. And then you've got a final stitch right here at the end. So the final stitch does not count as one of the vertical stitches. So get to these last 2 stitches, and then you're going to decrease again. So I'm going to cast on all of these knit stitches. So I've already done I've already cast on into vertical stitch 2 and 3, which means I'm going to start at vertical stitch number 4, and then I'm going to cast on until I get to not the second to last, but the one right before that. I'm not sure what you would call that, but right here where we are at the last 2 vertical stitches, and we decrease again. So Tunisian slip stitch into the first stitch, knit stitch into the second stitch. You're going to yarn over and pull through both of those stitches to cast on just 1 loop, and then you're going to cast on into the final stitch of the row. So here's my loop for the decrease. The final stitch of the row is going to be this bottommost stitch. So since you start the return pass with a chain 2, skip that chain 2, go to the very first or the bottommost stitch. Make sure you count your stitches. You should have 2 less stitches than you did before. So for row number 1 and 2, I had 14 stitches. That means for row number 3, I'm going to have 12 stitches. Row number 4 is just knit straight across. So you're going to do decreases every other row. So that means row number 4 is going to be just knit stitch all the way across. So again, row number 1 and row number 2 was 14 stitches, at least for me. Row number 3, row number 4 is going to be 12. Row number 5, row number 6 is going to be 10 because my decrease is going to be on row number 5. So my decreases are going to be in row 3, 5, and 7. If you don't need to crochet that many rows, or you need to crochet more, just remember to do your decreases every other row. Once you've completed however many rows you need for your specific sock size, complete that return pass all the way through. So the very last return pass you need. Chain 1 at the very end. This will make a little knot right before you cut your yarn. So cut a nice tail end of yarn. You're going to weave that in later. And then you're going to repeat all of these same steps on that second flap. So again, count your stitches, make sure that you have the same number of stitches and the same number of rows, and then you're going to do the same thing for the heel. Now for the heel, I do highly recommend that you actually count your stitches beforehand so you know where to begin your stitching. You are always going to begin on a full knit stitch. So that's going to be the very first stitch. If you look right here, this is not a full knit stitch. So it's part of a partial stitch, and this is where all of my increases kind of started. So it has to be a full knit stitch, and by this I mean that it needs to have a front leg and a back leg. Now if you turn your sock around so that you look at this bottom part, so the one that looks a little bit wider, it does have the same number of stitches, I promise. It just looks a little bit wider. Pay special attention to where you begin to cast on. So make sure again that you are looking at a full knit stitch. So not this little section right here with the increases, it's going to be right after the increase and decrease sections. So find the first full vertical stitch. So this one that's kind of open, kind of wide, go to the one right next to it. So right over here, that's going to be that first knit stitch of the row. So you see how this one's really open? That doesn't count as a full knit stitch. Go to the first full knit stitch, count 14 or however many stitches you need from there, and then begin the process all over again. So your, foundation row, row 1, row 2, and then decrease row 3, and so forth. Once you have all of your flaps like this, this is what your sock is going to look like. And at this point, you just have to do a ton of weaving. So all of these tail ends have to be woven in. I generally tend to leave one really long tail end, which I should have mentioned. I've mentioned it in other tutorials and I completely forgot to mention it in this one. But I leave a really long tail end to use to sew. But go through, weave in all of your tail ends before you sew everything. And yeah, then you can sew your sock. If you don't know how to sew this sock, give me just a moment. Let me weave everything in and I'll show you how. Alright, so here's my sock. I've woven everything in. I left this one long tail end. You're going to need a yarn, tapestry needle, whatever it is, whatever needle you have handy that your yarn fits through. And then you're going to line up the flaps. So the first stitch of the flap on one side and the first stitch of the flap on the other side. So I'm going to stitch right along here. And then I'm going to pick this first stitch like so, and we're going to tighten it up. So I'm working on the heel. The toe is a little bit easier, but the heel has this little space right here that you're going to have to stitch closed. So the toe doesn't have that, but that's why I'm showing you here on the heel. So just go through, tighten this up right here, and then stitch along this open part. Whatever stitch you want to use, just give it a stitch or two just to close it up. And then you'll stitch along this side. But I'm just going to leave the camera rolling so you can see how I stitch it. I still haven't fully recovered from losing my voice, and it's very slowly starting to go, and I've had to pause a lot to cough and drink water, so I'm going to stop right here. So don't forget to subscribe, follow my Instagram, go to the website, whatever you want, but enjoy the music. I'll see you in the next video.